Hello. Um, so we're going to finish up this book. We have just a couple chapters. I'm thinking of other books to read. I brought home a bunch of books. I wonder if I might just read some poetry because I brought home Langston Hughes poetry book from the poetry section. I love Langston Hughes. So I'll read some of those poems. We'll see. I'll think about it over the weekend. All right. So chapter 21. Then one morning, a teen returned. What happened? Am I still there? Yes. One morning, a teen returned. Matt had been waiting, watching the forest trail impatiently, unwilling to go far from the cabin lest he miss the boys coming. And when he finally saw a teen approaching, his heart sank. A teen was not alone. His grandfather stalked by his side. Matt sensed that this meant trouble. Perhaps Sackness had come to reproach him. He would surely know that the two boys had been neglecting those lessons. Dreading to face the old man, Matt walked out to meet him, courteously giving the greeting he had learned. Sackness returned his greeting with dignity. He did not smile. His solemn face made Matt's heart sink still lower. Then, startled, Matt turned toward a teen. He did not dare ask a question, but he saw at once that there was no need to ask. No doubt about it. A teen had found his manto. He had changed. He stood straighter and taller. He looked older, and Matt suddenly realized why. The black hair, which had always hung straight down almost to his shoulders, was shaved away. His scalp, like his grandfather's, was bare, except for a single patch running back from his forehead and braided into a top knot fastened with a red string. Like the fresh bear grease that glistened on his skin, pride glistened all over him. Moreover, he was carrying a gleaming new rifle. "You've got a gun," Matt cried, politeness forgiven. "My grandfather traded many beaver skins," a teen answered. Though he had in these last days become a man, he had not learned altogether to hide his feelings. He did not say more. He waited now for his grandfather to speak. The old man's face was grave. He did not ask about the lessons. "Time of sun gets shorter," he said, "like footsteps of bird, soon ice on water." "I know it's October," Matt said, "maybe November." He had not wanted to count his sticks these last weeks. "Indians go north now," Sackness continued. "Hunt moose. All Indian go. A teen not come more to learn white man's sign." Matt could not answer. "White father not come," Sackness went on. Matt spoke quickly. "He ought to be here any day now." Sackness looked at him soberly. "Maybe him not come," he said quietly. Anger flared up in Matt. He could not allow this man to speak the fear that he had never dared to admit to himself. "Of course he'll come," he said, too loudly. "He might even come today." "Snow comes soon," Sackness persisted. "Not good white boy stay here alone. White boy come with Indians." Matt stared at him. Did he mean go on the hunt with them? The most important hunt of the year? Sackness smiled for the first time. "Sackness teach white boy hunt moose like a teen. White boy and a teen be like brother." A sudden joyful hope sprang in Matt's mind. He realized at this moment just how anxious he had been. This was a way out. He did not have to stay here alone through the long winter. Then, as swiftly as it has come, his new hope died. In spite of his longing, in spite of being afraid, he knew what he had to answer. "Thank you," he said. "I'd like to go on the hunt, but I can't. When my father comes, he wouldn't know where I had gone." "Leave white man's writing." Matt swallowed hard. "Something might happen to the cabin. He's trusting me to take care of it." "Maybe him not come," Sackness said again, not smiling. "He'll be here soon," Matt insisted. He was ashamed that his voice broke in the middle of the word. "If he couldn't come, he'd send someone to tell me. He'd find some way no matter what happened. You don't know my pa." Sackness was silent for some time. "White boy, good son," he said at last. "But better you come. Sackness glad for white boy be Niquinis." Matt could only keep shaking his head. The man's word brought a great lump in his throat. "Thank you," he managed. "You've been very good to me, but I have to stay here." Without another word, Sackness held out his hand, and Matt put his own hand in that bony grasp. Then the two Indians turned and walked away. Atene had not even said goodbye. There would be no lesson that morning, no story, no tramping in the forest or fishing, not this morning or any other morning. Close to panic, Matt wanted to run after them. He wanted to tell them that he changed his mind, that he would go with them anywhere rather than stay alone with winter coming. But he set his jaw tight and stood where he was. After a few moments, he reached for his axe and went to splitting logs with a fury. He couldn't keep from thinking, however. Was he just being foolish and stubborn? Wasn't going with them the wisest thing he could have done? Wouldn't his father have understood? He remembered hearing that many white men, and white women too, had been captured by Indians and had lived many years in the wilderness, and did not want to return to the white world when they were given a chance, but chose instead to live with the Indians. He had never understood that, but now he could see that happening. He no longer distrusted them. He knew that Atene and his grandfather would be kind, that even the grandmother would make him welcome, and that they would share with him whatever they had, no matter how little. He had found friendship and goodwill in their cabin. He had envied Atene his free, unhampered life in the forest and the boisterous comradeship in the village. If he had been taken captive as a child and raised as an Indian boy, how would he himself have chosen? It wouldn't be the same to make that choice deliberately. He was proud that they had wanted him to live with them, but he knew that he could never be proud as Atene was proud of being a hunter. He belonged to his own people, and he was bound to his own family as Atene was bound to his grandfather. The thought that he might never see his mother again was sharper than hunger or loneliness. This was the land his father had cleared to make a home for them. It was his land, too. He could not run away. He was troubled that Atene had walked away without a word of farewell. Had he been offended? Had he really wanted Matt to go with him to be his brother? Or was he only obeying his grandfather as he had been about the lessons? It was so hard to tell what Atene was thinking. Atene had become a hunter. He had a gun. He would not have time now to wander through the forest or listen to stories. He would not have to bother any longer with the white boy who would never really be a mighty hunter. But surely Atene could have held out his hand as his grandfather had done. Every morning, in spite of himself, Matt kept an eye out for Atene. For 4 days had gone by when he decided there was little chance that he would see his friend again. Doubtless the Indians had already left the village and were on their way north. So when he saw Atene coming through the woods with his dog at his heels, he ran across the clearing to meet him, not bothering to hide his relief and pleasure. "You think different?" Atene asked. "You go with us?" Matt's eagerness died away. "No," he said unhappily. "Please try to understand. I must wait for my father." Atene nodded. "I understand," he said. "My grandfather understand too. I'd do same for my father if he still lived." The two boys stood looking at each other. There was no amusement and no scorn in Atene's eyes. How very strange, Matt thought. After all the brave deeds he had dreamed of to win this boy's respect, he had gained it at last by doing nothing, just by staying here and refusing to leave. "My grandfather send you gift," Atene said now. He unstrapped from his back a pair of snowshoes. They were new, the wood smooth and polished, the netting of deer hide woven in a neat design. Before Matt could find words, Atene went on. "My grandmother sent gift," he said. He took a small pouch of a birch basket of maple sugar. Late in the season like this, Matt knew, sugar was scarce and dear to the Indians. "Thank you," he said. "Tell your grandmother when you come back I'll help gather more sap for her." Atene was silent. "Not come back," he said. "In the spring, I mean, when the hunt is over." "Not come back. Not live in village again. Our people find new hunting ground," Atene repeated. "But this is your home." "My people hunters. My grandfather say many white men come soon, cut down trees, make house, plant corn. Where my people hunt." What could Matt answer to this? He had only one argument to offer. "Your grandfather wants you to learn to read reminded a teen. I haven't been much of a teacher, but when my family comes, it will be different. My mother will teach you to read and to write. What for I read? My grandfather, mighty hunter. My father, mighty hunter. They not read. Your grandfather wants you to be able to understand treaties, Matt insisted. We go far away, no more white men, not need to sign paper. An uncomfortable doubt had long been troubling Matt. Now, before a teen went away, he had to know. This land, he said slowly, this place where my father built his cabin, did it belong to your grandfather? Did he own it once? How one man own ground? A teen questioned. Well, my father owns it now. He bought it. I not understand, a teen scowled. How can man own land? Land, same as air. Land for all people to live on, for beaver and deer. Does deer own land? How could you explain, Matt wondered, to somebody who did not want to understand? Somewhere in the back of his mind, there was a sudden suspicion that a teen was making sense, and he was not. It was better not to talk about it. Instead, he asked, where will you go? My grandfather says much farthest where sun goes down. White men not come so far. To the west. Matt had heard his father talk about the west. There was good land there for the taking. Some of his neighbors in Quincy had chosen to go west instead of buying land in Maine. How could he tell a teen that there would be white men there too? Still, they said there was no end to the land in the west. He reckoned that there must be enough for both white men and Indians. Before he could think what to say, a teen spoke again. I give you a gift, he said. Dog like you. I tell him stay with you. You mean you're not taking him with you? No good for hunt, a teen said. Walk slow now. Good for stay here with Madabi, with white brother. A teen's careless words did not deceive Matt. He knew very well how a teen felt about that good-for-nothing dog that followed him everywhere he went. And a teen had said white brother. Matt could not find the words he needed, but he knew there was something he must do. He had to give a gift for a teen, and he had nothing to give, nothing at all that belonged to him. Robinson Crusoe? What could that mean to a boy who would never learn now to read it? He did have one thing. At the thought of it, something twisted in his stomach. It was the only thing he could possibly give to match the gifts that a teen had given him. Wait here. He went into the cabin and took down the tin box. The watch was ticking away inside it. He had never forgotten to wind it, even when he was too tired to notch a stick. Now he lifted it out and held it in his hand the way he had held it when his father had given it to him, as though it were fragile, like a bird's egg. His father would never understand. Before he could think about it another minute, Matt hurried back to where a teen stood waiting. I have a gift for you, he said. It tells the time of the day. I'll show you how to wind it. A teen held the watch even more carefully. There was no mistaking that he was pleased and impressed. Probably, Matt thought, a teen would never learn to use it. The sun and the shadows and the trees told him all he needed to know about the time of the day. But a teen knew that Matt's gift was important. Fine gift, he said. He put the watch very gently into his pouch, and he held out his other hand. Awkwardly, the two boys shook hands. Your father comes soon, a teen said. I hope you get the biggest moose in Maine, Matt answered. A teen turned and walked into the woods. The dog sprang up to follow him. A teen motioned him back and uttered one stern order. Puzzled, the dog sank down and put his chin between his paws. As the teen walked away, he whined softly, but he obeyed. Matt knelt down and put his hand on the dog's head. Chapter 23. Matt filled his days with work. He made the cabin trim. Where the clay had dried and crumbled away between the logs, he brought new mud, strengthened it with pebbles, and packed the spaces tightly. On the inside, he chinked every tiny crack to make the room snug. The pile of logs stacked against the cabin wall grew steadily higher. His meager harvest was safely stored away. The corn, the little he had managed to save from the deer and the crows, had all been shucked. Sitting by the fire after supper, he scraped the dried kernels from the cob, remembering the long evenings at home when he and his sister Sarah had been set the same work with the corn scraper. Sarah would laugh now to see him rubbing away with an old clamshell like an Indian. Some of the ears of corn he had hung against the wall, by the twisted husks as he had seen his mother do. She had said once they were dry, the scraps of sunshine in the dark days, and overhead he hung strips of pumpkin on ropes strung wall to wall. They would be ready for his mother to make into pies. In the corner, he leaned the old flour sack, overflowing with the nuts he gathered, hickory and butternut, and even acorns. He had once thought proper food only for squirrels. On the shelf ranged birch baskets filled with dried berries and wild cranberries he had discovered shining like jewels along the boggy shores of the pond. They were puckery to the tongue, but when his mother came, she would bring sugar, and stewed cranberries would make a fine feast with her bread of white flour. Matt forced himself to eat sparingly of these things. The corn he regarded as a sort of trust. His father had planted it, and he would be counting on it to feed the family through the winter. Some must be saved for the spring planting. Proud though he was of his harvest, Matt knew in his heart that it was far from enough. The hunt for food would be never ending. Hour after hour with his bow, Matt tramped through the forest, the dog beside him. There was not much game to hunt these days, and more often than not, his snares were empty. Soon the animals would be buried deep in burrows. Twice he glimpsed a caribou moving through the trees, but he had little hope of bringing down any large animal with his light arrows. Once in a while, he succeeded in shooting a duck or a muskrat. The squirrels were too thick for him. Too quick, not thick. Although the dog was certainly not much of a hunter, he did occasionally track down some small creature. But he also had to eat his share, and sometimes more than his share, because Matt could not resist those beseeching eyes. Truth to tell, they were both hungry most of the time. Luckily, they would not starve with the pond and the creeks teeming with fish. Matt knew that for many months of the year, fish filled the Indian cookpots. Luckily, fish were easy to catch, though Matt had to be continually twisting and splicing new lines from vines and spruce roots. Mornings now, he had to shatter a skim of ice on the pond. Soon he would have to cut holes with his axe and let his lines down deep. He shivered to think of it. It was the cold that bothered him the most. His homespun jacket was still sound, but since he had little use for it from warm weather, but his breeches were threadbare. One knee showed naked through a gaping hole, and the frayed leg stopped a good 5 inches above his ankles. His linen shirt was as thin as a page of the Bible, and so small for him that it threatened to split every time he moved. Even inside the cabin, he was scarcely warm enough. The moment he ventured outside, his teeth chattered. He thought enviously of the Indian deerskin leggings, but a deer was far beyond his prowess as a hunter. There were 2 blankets on his pine bed, his father's and his own. Why couldn't one of them cover him in the daytime as well as in the night? He spread a blanket out on the floor and hacked at it with a knife and an axe, using his worn-out breeches as a pattern, and from the leftover scraps he carefully pulled threads and twisted them together. He had seen Indian women using bone needles, and he searched about outside the cabin until he found some thin, hard bits of bone. Then he shaved it down with his knife. He ruined 3 bits trying to poke a hole through the bone before he thought to try a thin slit instead to hold the thread. Finally, he managed to sew his woolen pieces together. He thrust his legs into the shapeless breeches and gathered the top about his waist with a bit of rope. He was mighty pleased with himself. He was going to be forever hauling them up, and they were sure to trip him if he had to run, but at least he could kneel on the ice and pull in his lines. From 2 rabbit skins, he made some mittens without thumbs. He had no stockings, and his moose hide moccasins were wearing thin. He decided he could stuff them with scraps of blankets or even duck feathers. He remembered that once in a downpour, a teen had showed him how to line his moccasins with dried moss to soak up the rain. Perhaps moss could soak up cold as well, and there was plenty of it about. His most satisfying achievement was his fur hat. For this, he knew he must have more fur. In the woods, a teen had once pointed out to him deadfall, constructed of heavy logs so intricately balanced that they would fall with deadly accuracy on an animal that attempted to steal the bait inside. Beavers and otters were cut in such traps, a teen explained, and sometimes even a bear. Now Matt determined to make one for himself, perhaps a small one. It would take a very large log, even, to stun a strong animal, and he had no wish to come upon a wounded bear. Much as he would like to have a bear skin, he would try for a smaller animal. He felled and trimmed two good-sized trees, setting the logs on lighter posts with a feat of delicate balance that took him hours of patience, trial, and error. Over and over they crashed down, threatening his toes and fingers. Finally, they held to his satisfaction, and gingerly he slipped three fish inside the trap. To his astonishment, on the third morning, he found an animal lying under the fallen logs, so nearly dead that it was no task to club it. It was smaller than the otters he had seen playing along the banks, a fisher perhaps. That night, he and the dog feasted on crackling bits of roast meat. It was strong flavored, and he knew the Indians wouldn't care for it, but he could not be so choosy. Other strips he hung over the fire to smoke. There was also a scant amount of yellow fat. Used sparingly, a spoonful of that fat would make his usual fish diet taste like a banquet. The real treasure was the pelt, heavy and lustrous. He worked on it carefully, as he had watched the Indian women do. With his sharp-edged stone, he scraped away every trace of fat and flesh from the skin, washed it in the creek, and for days in his spare hours rubbed and stretched it to make it soft and pliable. Then he set to work with his bone needle. He was enormously proud of the cap he fashioned. Sackness himself would have envied it. Much of this work was done by firelight. He longed for candles. He ate his supper by the light of a split pine branches set up in a crack in the chimney. They gave light aplenty, but they smoked and dripped sticky pitch. And he was always afraid he might drop off to sleep and wake up to find the log chimney afire. At any rate, after a day of chopping and tramping, he was tired enough to go to bed with the dark. So often as he did the squaw's work that a teen would have despised, thoughts of his mother filled his head. He imagined her moving around the cabin, humming her little tunes as she beat out a batch of cornbread, shaking out the board at the door, and of course she would not let them eat at a bare table. He could see her sitting by the firelight in the evening, her knitting needles clicking as she made a woolen sock for him. Sometimes he could almost hear the sound of her voice, and when he shut his eyes, he could see her special smile. He tried to think of ways to please her. She would need new dishes for good meals that she would cook. He whittled out 4 wooden trenchers and 4 clean new bowls, rubbing them smooth the sand from the creek. He made a little brush to clean them with, from a birch sapling, carefully splitting the ends into thin fibers. In the same way, he made a sturdy birch broom to sweep the floor. Then he set himself a more difficult task, a cradle for the baby. With only an axe and his knife, the work took all his patience. His first attempts were only fit for kindling, but when the cradle was done, he was proud of it. It was clumsy, perhaps, but it rocked without bumping, and there wasn't a splinter anywhere to harm a baby's skin. Sitting by the fire, it seemed to promise that soon his family would be there. When he had a few more rabbit skins, he would make a soft coverlet. For Sarah, he had made a corn husk doll with corn silk hair. He was surprised at how much he looked forward to seeing Sarah. Back at home, she had been nothing but a pesky child, always following him about and pestering him to be taken along wherever he was going. Now he remembered the way she had run to meet him when he came home from school, pigtails flying, eyes shining, demanding to know everything that had happened. Sarah fiercely hated being a girl and having no school to go to. She would be full of curiosity in the forest. She wasn't afraid like most girls. She was spunky enough to try anything. She was like that Indian girl, a teen sister. What a pity they couldn't know each other. Matt stood looking up at the sky over the clearing. It's going to snow, he told the dog. You can feel it, can't you? The dog lifted its nose, testing the promise in the air. Matt reckoned he had been lucky so far. The heavy snows had not come. There had been flurries, thin and swirling, sifting through the trees. Many mornings he walked to find a coating of white on the cabin roof, which would melt away under the noonday sun. Today, everything seemed different. The sky was the color of his mother's pewter plate. The brown, withered leaves of the oak trees hung motionless from the branches. 3 crows searched noisily among the dried cornstalks. A flock of small birds hopped nervously under the pines. It's almost Christmas time, he said out loud. He could not remember for sure how many weeks belonged to each month. Sometimes he could not be certain that he remembered to cut a notch for every day. Each day was so like the day before, and Christmas Day, when it came, would not have been anything different than the others. He tried to put out of his mind the thought of his mother's Christmas pudding. "We'd better get in extra firewood," he said, and the dog scrambled eagerly after him. Late in the day, the snow began, soundlessly and steadily. Before dark, it had lain a white blanket over the trees and the stumps in the cabin. When Matt and the dog went outside at bedtime, the chilly whiteness reached over his moccasins and closed around his bare ankles. They were both thankful to hurry inside again. Next morning, the darkness of the cabin, Matt made his way to the door. He could scarcely push it open. The bank of snow outside reached almost to the latch. He stared at it in alarm. Was he going to be a prisoner in his own cabin? With all his preparations, he had never thought of making a shovel. His axe would be about as useful as a teaspoon. He set himself to hewing a slab of firewood to make a sort of a blade. By the time he dug a few feet of pathway, the sun was high. He stepped into a dazzling white world. Now at last he could make use of the snowshoes that hung on the cabin wall. Eagerly he strapped the bindings about his legs and climbed out into the narrow path he had dug. The snowshoes held him lightly. He stood poised on the snow like a duck on water. But with his first steps, he discovered that he could not even waddle like a duck on land. The clumsy hoops got in each other's way, one of them forever getting trapped beneath the other. All at once he got the knack of it, and he wanted to shout out loud. He tramped from one of his snares to another, waiting every few moments for the dog, who floundered happily behind him. The snares were buried deep and empty, and he just set them higher, just in case some animal might venture out of its burrow. He tramped all the way to the pond for the sheer pleasure of it. Coming back through the woods, he marveled at his own tracks, like claw prints of a giant bird. Suddenly he realized that he was happy, as he had never been in the weeks since a teen had went away. He was no longer afraid of the winter ahead. The snowshoes had set him free. The cabin was warm and welcoming. He melted snow in his kettle and made tea from the tips of a hemlock. He shelled and crushed a handful of acorns and boiled them with a strip of pumpkin. Afterwards, for the first time in weeks, he took down Robinson Crusoe. Reading by the firelight, he felt drowsy and contented. Life on a warm island in the Pacific might be easier, but tonight Matt's thought he wouldn't for a moment have given up his snug cabin buried in snow. 3 days later, snow threatened again, and Matt gathered a pile of firewood to dry inside. He had just carried in his third armhill when he heard the dog barking frantically a distance away. Matt found him standing on the bank of the creek, his feet braced, a ridge of hair bracing along his back. Peering along the creek, Matt caught his breath. Something dark was moving along the frozen course of the stream, a huge shape, too large to be an animal, even a moose. Then he saw it was a man, dragging behind him some sort of sled. He didn't move like an Indian. As he watched, Matt made out a second, smaller shape, just coming into sight around the bend of the creek. He did not dare shout for fear that they would vanish like ghosts. He stood still, his heart pounding, and then he began to run. "Pa!" he choked. His father flung down the pack he was carrying. His arms went around Matt and held him fast, though he could not manage to speak a word. Then Matt saw his mother struggling to climb down from the sled. He bent and threw his arms around her. How small she seemed, even under the heavy cloak. Sarah came floundering through the snow in her father's footsteps and stood staring at him, her eyes bright under the woolen hood. She wasn't the child he remembered. Awkwardly, he put his arms around her and gave her a hug. Then they were all talking at once, trying to be heard over the fierce clamor of the dog. "Quiet," he shouted at him. "This is my family. They've come. They're actually here." They pushed their way through the snow to the cabin, leaving the sled where it stood in the middle of the ice. Matt helped his mother over the doorstep. He could see she was scarcely able to stand, and he pulled a stool nearer the fire for her. She clung to him, her eyes on his face. Matt would hardly have recognized her. She was so thin and pale, with great shadows under her eyes. But her eyes were warm and shining, and her smile was as beautiful as he remembered. I was bound to get here before Christmas, she said. I couldn't have borne it if I let Christmas go by. Oh, Matt, you're safe. It was typhus, his father explained. We all took sick with it, and the fever was bad. Takes all the strength out of a body. Your ma got the worst of it, and we ought to have waited longer until she was more fit, but she was dead set on starting. The river is most frozen shut. We had to wait at the trading post 3 weeks before anyone would risk carrying us. Then we had to get the sled made. But your ma, she kept pushing us. She's a rare one, your ma. I had to, thinking of you alone in this place, she said. It wasn't bad. I wasn't alone all the time. I had the Indians. Indians, his mother gasped. Are there Indians here? Pa said there wouldn't be, Sarah exclaimed. What are they like? Well, they're gone now, Matt said. But they were my friends. Then he brought it out proudly. I had an Indian brother. From the way they stared at him, he could have seen it was going to take a mighty lot of explaining before they would understand. He didn't suppose they ever would, truly. His father said nothing. He was looking soberly at the snowshoes propped against the wall and at the bow hanging over the door where the rifle should have been. Everywhere he looked, Matt realized he must see that the Indians had given him or taught him how to make for himself. However, his father seemed to think there was no time for questions now. We better unpack the sled, he said, before it starts to snow again. Matt sprang to help. There was one question he dared not ask until he and his father were alone. The baby, did you leave it behind? His father ran a hand over his beard. His eyes were troubled. The little one only lived 5 days, he answered. It was a pitiful little thing that would never have made the journey. Just don't say anything to your ma. She still takes it hard. Matt promised and wished he had somehow been able to hide the cradle before she noticed it. Standing in the snow, his father reached to put a hand on his shoulder. You've done a grown man's job, son, and I'm very proud of you. Matt could not speak. It took his breath away to think that he might have gone with the Indians, that they might have come to an empty cabin and found all his mother's fears had come true. He would never have heard the words his father had just spoken. This was how a teen had felt. He knew when he had found his Manitou and become a hunter. As his father untied the bundles from the sledge, Matt lugged them into the cabin. Flour, molasses, a new kettle, warm bright quilts, and thanks be, new boots for him and a woolen jacket and pants. He felt richer than Robinson Crusoe with all the plunder from that sunken ship. He noted that his father had a new rifle, and presently he discovered poking out from his mother's back his old brown musket. He hadn't a doubt that she learned to use it, and would have too had her family been threatened. He suspected that even Sarah, so grown up now, wouldn't have feared to pull a trigger if there had been a need. Well, there'd be no more need of it with 2 men to fend for them. Inside the cabin, Sarah was bustling about, unwrapping the pewter dishes, setting out the little whale oil lamp that always stood on the table in Quincy. That's the funniest dog I ever saw, she said. It won't come near us. He's an Indian dog, Matt told her. He's suspicious of white folks. You wait. You'll get to like him. But he couldn't get over how much older she looked, but still spunky. Her eyes were sparkling, and Matt suspected that for the long journey had just been an adventure. He should have made her a beau instead of a doll. He would have, too. The first chance he got. His mother had thrown off her cloak and stirred the fire, and she was making a great show of coming home. If the cabin seemed roughed and cramped after the pretty house she had left behind, she never let on for a moment. She admired everything, the drying ears of corn, the strings of pumpkin, and the new wooden bowls he had carved. All this food, she marveled, and I've been fearing that you were starving. He was thankful now for the times he had gone hungry to save what he could for their coming. There's jerky for supper, he told her. I tried not to eat too much of it. You can make a pretty fair stew with that and a little pumpkin. Some salt would surely help if you had any. As he started out again, his mother stopped him and put her hands on his shoulders. Wait a minute, she said. I just want to look at you. She had to tip her head back. You're different, Matt. You're almost as tall as your pa and awfully thin. You're so brown I would have taken you for an Indian. I almost was one, he said, giving her a quick hug to show he was joking. We're going to have neighbors, she said, as she set the kettle over the fire. A man and his wife have a claim not 5 miles from here. They're staying at this trading post until spring. We plan to share a pair of oxen. They say 3 other families are coming too. They're going to set up a mill. Before you know it, we'll have a town here, maybe even a school for neighbors. Maybe even a school for children. Neighbors. That was the thought that would take some getting used to. Matt supposed he ought to be pleased. Yes, of course he was pleased. It was just that he rather liked the way it had been here in the forest before. With all that gladness in him right now, you wouldn't think there'd be room for any other thoughts. But even now, with his family here, their voices filling the long silence and all the worries vanishing like smoke up the chimney, he suddenly thought of the Indians. He wished that Etienne and his grandfather could have known that he had been right to stay, that his father had come as he had promised. But the old man had been right, too. More white men were coming. There would be a town here on the land where the Indians had hunted the caribou and the beaver. If only he could be sure that the Indians had found a new hunting ground. Matt thrust his arms into his new jacket and went out again in the snow. Behind him, the cabin glowed, warmed and filled with life. Already the steam was rising from the new kettle. He'd cook one of his special stews for them for supper, and he wouldn't have to eat it alone. They would all sit together around the table and bow their heads while his father asked the blessing. Then he would tell them about Etienne. And that's it. End of the book. All right, so that's the end of the Sign of the Beaver. I will think about what book to read next week, and I'll put something on Facebook. All right? Good night. Goodbye. Have a good weekend. I miss you.